my water just broke. I felt like things really intensified.
She was right there and she was coming.
It was an amazing feeling.
I'm gonna cry just thinking about it. I could feel her head.
We heard her cry. We were squeezing hands and she was screaming.
I'm Bryn Hunt Palmer, and you're listening to The Birth Hour. This podcast is designed as a safe place to come together and share childbirth stories. Stick around and join us to hear informative and empowering birth journeys from all over the world. I'd like to take a minute to talk about this episode's sponsor, Aeroflow Breast Pumps. Did you know that breast pumps and milk storage bags, maternity compression garments, even lactation education and support can all be covered by your insurance? Aeroflow helps millions of parents unlock these breastfeeding and postpartum essentials by working directly with your insurance company to get these free essentials shipped straight to your door. Aeroflow offers all major pump brands, including Medela, Spectra, Motif, Lancino, Amita, LV, Willow, and more. Visit aeroflowbreastpumps.com/birthhour to fill out their free and easy qualify through insurance form. Don't forget to use the promo code BirthHour15 in their online shop for 15% off all supplies and accessories. You've got enough on your plate. Why not let Aeroflow Breast Pumps help support you on your breastfeeding journey? At the end of this episode, I talk with Kate not only about getting her breast pump for free through Aeroflow, but also about taking advantage of their online lactation classes. So stay tuned for that conversation. Before we get to today's birth story, I want to talk a little bit about our online childbirth course. It's called Know Your Options, and this is the course you've been looking for if you just have that gut feeling that you know you should be taking a childbirth course, but maybe the one that's being offered to you by your care provider is not exactly what you're looking for. It might be more catered towards the type of birth they want you to have versus making you informed of all your different options and how to address different things that happen in birth, because as this podcast has shown us, birth is very unpredictable. So we would love to have you check out our 12-module course. You can go to thebirthhour.com/course to see detailed outlines of what is included in the course. You will also get a bonus course called Beyond the First Latch that is an additional 6 modules all about pumping, feeding your baby, going back to paid work if that's part of your plan. And we have a special coupon code for you. It's 100OFF for $100 off enrollment. Again, that's thebirthhour.com/course. Another way you can get involved with the Birth Hour community is by joining our Patreon. This is where you pledge your support of the Birth Hour at $5 a month or more, and you get perks in return, like access to all of our archived episodes. That's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of episodes. We've been putting out birth stories since 2015, and those are all available in our archives via Patreon. And you also get access to our private Facebook community, which is a really great group of people who are there to support you, become friends, and just encourage you on this journey through parenthood. So find out more about that at patreon.com/birthhour. Today's birth story guest is Margot, and she has 2 stories to share. Her first, she was pregnant in French Polynesia and gave birth in Tahiti. She was living on a boat at the time, so there's some interesting components there. And then she was back in the U.S. for her second birth, and she talks about that experience as well. All right, let's hear from Margot. Hi, Margot. Welcome to the Birth Hour. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bryn.
Of course. Before we get to your birth stories, can you tell listeners a little bit about you and your family?
Yeah, my name is Margot, and I live in Friday Harbor, Washington, with my husband, Elliot, and my 2 children. Remy is almost 3 years old, and Esme is almost 3 months old. Elliot and I have been together for 13 years and married for almost 6. And I'm at home full time these days, but in my free moments, I am swimming or making art. And today I'm going to share both of my birth stories with you.
All right. Well, let's start with your first pregnancy, wherever you want to start us off there.
Okay, great. We knew we wanted to start a family, but we had also just bought a 38-foot sailboat, and this was about 2018. And we had big plans to take this boat out cruising. And I knew deep down that if we had a baby first, our boat dreams would never happen. So we set off on that adventure with the plan to start our family when we returned. But then COVID happened, our timeline kind of shifted, and we ended up leaving the docks a year later than our original plan. So by the time we made it down to Mexico, I was 36, and I just had the big realization that if we put off having a baby until afterwards, it might never happen. So I decided to remove my Nexplanon birth control implant, and we opened up the possibility of getting pregnant. We left for our Pacific Ocean crossing in April 2022. It took us 29 days to cross the Pacific Ocean from La Cruz, Mexico to Nukuhiva in the Marquesas, which is a chain of islands in French Polynesia. We had a really slow and uneventful passage, which is a really good thing in the sailing world because anything eventful usually involves something really important breaking or horrible weather. So uneventful is really good. And we found ourselves with some extra time on our hands. And so then about a month later, we discovered I was pregnant. We thought that there was no way that we would get pregnant just 1 month after removing my birth control. So even though we were planning on having a baby, the timing of everything made it all seem like a surprise pregnancy. But it was a very welcome surprise. And as far as origin stories go, we love knowing that our little ocean baby was conceived on the bow of our sailboat at sunset in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, very romantic. Did you have morning sickness worse on a boat?
I did not have morning sickness at that point. I did have it a little bit later on. After the reality of being pregnant settled in, we were faced with the decision of where we would have the baby. Would we stay in French Polynesia, or would we go back to the States, or would we continue sailing west to New Zealand? There seemed to be so many options on the table, and they all felt really complicated. We didn't have a home to go back to in the United States because our boat was our home at this point. Continuing west would involve a lot of sailing while very pregnant and then entering another new country with so many variables and uncertainty. So it took us months to finally decide that we would just stay in French Polynesia. I want to take a moment here and just give a little background. French Polynesia is an overseas territory of France and is governed by France, and everyone speaks French. Many people also speak their own native languages, but French is the universal language, and there's very little English that's spoken outside of Tahiti, and still not much in Tahiti once you get off the beaten tourist path. It does have a local government as well, but the infrastructure is French and their healthcare system is French, and many of the medical professionals I saw during my time there were from France. I can speak what I call functional French. I make a lot of mistakes, but I have pretty good listening comprehension, and I'm usually able to get my point across, even though I make a ton of grammatical errors and some stuff always ends up lost in translation. The French approach to prenatal care is very midwife-centered. There are midwives who work in the hospital, and there are midwives who have their own private practice, but they don't really overlap. Most of the prenatal and postnatal care is done by midwives in private practice. Home births, however, are discouraged to the point of not being allowed at all, although I'm sure there are some accidental home births that happen from time to time. Hospital births are the norm, and most women from outlying islands throughout French Polynesia come to Tahiti to give birth. With the French system, your prenatal midwife appointments include 8 birth education classes, and your postnatal midwife appointments include up to 10 pelvic floor rehabilitation sessions. Typically, around 34 or 36 weeks, your midwife will refer you to an OB at a hospital where you'll have your birth, and then you'll go back to your midwife for postnatal care. When you live on a boat, you meet all sorts of interesting people from all around the world and from all walks of life. And even though everyone's very different, you all have boat life in common. And so there's a lot of socializing between boats and happy hours and potlucks and group hikes. As luck would have it, a couple weeks after I found out I was pregnant, we found ourselves anchored next to a boat that belonged to an awesome midwife named Anne, who had worked with the indigenous people of rural northern Canada. Anne came over to our boat and gave me a whole rundown on what to expect with my pregnancy, a timeline of important appointments, and helpful recommended reading, like the Birthing from Within book that has become one of my go-to reference books. She also very wisely suggested that I read 1 book about breastfeeding before the baby is born. Unfortunately, I did not take this advice, and I really ended up regretting it later on. I was also very grateful to have the Libby app on my phone that allowed me to get digital copies of these books using my library card from the States. But sadly, at this point, I had not yet heard of the Birth Hour podcast, which was a huge bummer. My first trimester, I had pretty bad nausea. Nothing out of the realm of normal, but being on a boat made it really miserable. We were in a very rolly anchorage, and the motion of the boat, in addition to the crazy boat spells, made what would have been bearable on land unbearable in the sailboat. It's easy when you're looking at people's Instagram posts or their YouTube channels to see the glamorous side of living on a sailboat, the beautiful clear water and the dolphins on the bow and cocktails in hand. But there's a lot of really unglamorous things about boat life, and boat smells is definitely one of them. And my senses were so heightened at the time. And even though it was really unpleasant, it was also at sometimes helpful. On more than one occasion, I was able to identify a diesel leak or that our propane had been left on well before my husband could detect anything. The only thing that really deviated from my expectations in early pregnancy was the amount of cramping I experienced. I had very persistent cramping, like heavy period cramping that would last most of the day. And as a result, I was constantly worried about having a miscarriage. We had decided to stick close to Nukuhiva, where there was a small hospital and some midwives, until I was able to have my 12-week scan. But we wanted to explore a little bit, so we were making short trips to the nearby islands. While anchored on the backside of Hiva Oa at about 9 weeks pregnant, my cramping became so severe and persistent that I called their tiny local hospital and they advised me to come in. I had to hitchhike there in the company of another woman from another sailboat who also needed some medical care. Their one midwife on the island wasn't available that day, so I had an appointment with a very cocky French male doctor who advised that we do a quick ultrasound to rule out an ectopic pregnancy, which is what I had been worried about. And fortunately, we did rule that out and everything looked healthy. And this was my first time hearing the heartbeat and seeing our baby on the screen. And on top of everything, they didn't even charge me for this appointment. A couple weeks later, I was able to have my routine checkups with the French midwives at the hospital in Nukuhiva and tour their simple facilities. They explained that if I had a low-risk pregnancy, I could choose to have my baby there. But if any complications came up, I would be looking at an emergency helicopter transport to Tahiti without my husband. When I asked if they could perform an emergency C-section, I got a response that was like, yeah, we could, but it won't be pretty. And so these answers made us lean towards the decision to go to Tahiti for the birth. I didn't end up having any red flags throughout my pregnancy, but I was 36 at the time and I'm a big worrier. And so the thought of an emergency transport without my partner just seemed like a big stress for me. We stayed in Nukuhiva for a couple more weeks so we could have our dating ultrasound and the nuchal transparency scan done by a visiting ultrasound technician who only came there once a month. All of my paperwork was kept in a physical file, a dossier that traveled with me as I moved around from place to place. Compared to the States, when everything is plugged into a computer, I really liked feeling the heft of this file get bigger as I got bigger. I would also like to add that these appointments without any health insurance, since I was not yet in their system, and I had travel insurance, but it didn't cover prenatal expenses, it only cost $12 a visit. Around the beginning of my second trimester, my nausea had mostly subsided and I had a gap of time before the 20-week anatomy scan. And so we decided it was the right time to start sailing towards Tahiti. We stopped in the Tuamotus, which is a chain of atolls about halfway to Tahiti from the Marquesas. This was a really nice chapter of my pregnancy. I was finally able to enjoy our travels and I was feeling really good in my body and my baby bump was finally showing. The most challenging part of this time was finding fresh vegetables. In these remote islands, our shopping was done in these little magasins, which are tiny little stores, and they get restocked every week by a supply boat that has a very finite amount of fresh vegetables and other coveted groceries. It ends up being a mad dash by all the boat people to get these vegetables, and we all must look really silly to the local population, who very wisely puts the food they need aside before they put anything on the shelves for the boaters. It's like Black Friday, but for food and on Wednesdays. Although we were loving the crystal clear water and remote coral beaches of the Tuamotus, we needed to push towards Tahiti. I had made some calls and had an appointment to get my anatomy scan with a midwife around 22 weeks. And so that gave us a clear time frame for our sail. We had decided to spend the money to moor our boat in the Papeete Marina while we were in Tahiti, aware that as I got bigger and bigger, getting on and off the boat via inflatable dinghy was going to get harder and harder. Papeete is the main city in Tahiti, and the marina is conveniently located right downtown. We found out during our anatomy scan that we were having a boy. Around the same time, after doing a little research online, I came across the Tumu Ora birth house, or as they call it in French, a maison de naissance. Birth centers are quite common here in the States, but in French Polynesia they are not, and the Tumu Ora birth house is the only birth house in Tahiti and might be the only one in all of French Polynesia. The birth house is situated right next to the hospital, like so close that they share a parking lot. And so this seemed like an extremely appealing option for me to be able to have an unmedicated birth in a cozy, intimate setting while having the safety net of a hospital so close by. The birth house is run by a core group of 3 midwives who rotate doing the appointments and being on call. So you get to know all of them and have at least one of them with you for your birth. But you just don't know which one you're going to have. They also have a large team of supporting midwives that may be called in to help with your birth. In order to give birth there, I needed to be registered in their healthcare system. After being in French Polynesia for 6 months and without other prenatal insurance coverage, I could qualify for health coverage in French Polynesia, but actually obtaining that coverage required tons and tons of paperwork and documentation of all of our finances and trips to all sorts of bureaucratic offices trying to explain how our permanent address is a boat that moves around from place to place, and taking care of all of this in my less than perfect French. It took months to work this out, but we persevered, jumped through all their hoops, and by the time our baby was born, we had French Polynesian health insurance for our entire family for $75 a month. Our prenatal care with the midwives at Tumu Ora was excellent. As I mentioned before, it included multiple sessions of birth education, which of course was in French, although they did make an effort to try to translate a little into English for my husband. The birth house also hosted workshops for birth-related things like prenatal yoga and prenatal chanting, Reiki, and the benefits of osteopathy. Participating in these kind of things really fulfilled a craving I had to be part of a community of women during this time. One of the most helpful resources they gave me was the loan of a 3-part book called La Naissance en BD by Lucille Gomez. This translates as Birth in Cartoons. These books are fabulous and witty, and they do such a wonderful job of empowering the reader to trust that their body has everything it needs to give birth. They transformed all my fears into real excitement for an unmedicated birth, and after reading them, I felt ready to birth this baby. I like these books so much that I tracked them down and spent way too much money to get my own copies recently so I could reread and prepare for my second birth. And I'm bummed that there's not an English translation of them, or else I'd be buying them for every pregnant friend I know. Being in downtown Papeete was very different than our time on the more remote islands. We were right downtown, which had its advantages and disadvantages. I had giant cruise ships in our backyard and felt awkward doing my prenatal yoga on the bow of my boat with an audience of people parading by. But we were also really close to the giant vegetable market that happened every Saturday. After the scarcity of vegetables in my first 2 trimesters, I all of a sudden had easy access to so many wonderful vegetables, and my husband made me these lavish dinner salads to satisfy my cravings. Being in an urban place, we were also close to big supermarkets again, and we could find almost anything we wanted if we were willing to pay the price. As my due date approached, like most women, I was getting really uncomfortable. I had lots of pelvic girdle pain, lots of sweatiness and grouchiness being on a hot boat in the middle of summer in the tropics. A couple of things I found that really helped me were swimming. I love swimming, and I found a 50-meter pool that was within walking distance of our boat that I continued swimming at up until my due date. I also met a woman at the birth house who did Watsu water massage and found those sessions to be really therapeutic and relaxing. Around month 9, I was really hating being on the boat, and I was having trouble squeezing my body through our small doors. So we made the decision to get off the boat for a couple months and found ourselves a short-term rental with an extra room since my mom was planning on coming for the birth. In the weeks leading up to the birth, I did all the little things that the midwives recommended. I ate the dates, I drank the raspberry tea, I did the perineal massage. Moving onto land had some unforeseen discomforts, though. I had taken for granted all the handholds that are on the boat. Even though we were really squished in there are places to hold on almost everywhere, and I had been using them to turn myself around in bed and to lower myself onto the toilet, and I found that I really missed them. I also didn't realize that on the water there were way less mosquitoes, and all of a sudden on land in Tahiti in summer, there were mosquitoes everywhere, but I was so large that I couldn't reach some of the places where they were landing, and it was driving me nuts. A couple days before my due date, I started getting some contractions that felt different than the Braxton Hicks ones I had been experiencing throughout the 3rd trimester. They were mostly at night, and then they would fizzle out in the early morning. My due date came and went, and my mom had made it to Tahiti by this point. I would say my actual labor began about 3 days after my due date, which was a Wednesday. This was when my contractions started feeling like they were coming at regular intervals, about 10 to 15 minutes apart, and they felt like severe menstrual cramps. From the notes I wrote to myself at this time, I remarked that the mosquito bites were still way more annoying than the contractions. I had borrowed an exercise ball from the birth house and spent a lot of time rolling around on that thing. That night, I was unable to get comfortable and unable to sleep through the contractions, which ended up being the first of many sleepless nights. Elliot and I ended up spending the night on the couch in the living room with the sliding door open to the moonlight, and although the contractions were not getting closer together than 7 to 10 minutes, they were getting a lot stronger. The next day, Thursday, I was due to go into the hospital for a routine monitoring that they do every other day after you go past your due date. I knew deep down it was too early for me to go into the birth center, but I decided I would rather go get a check with the midwives than deal with the hospital. I think deep down I was hoping that I would discover I was further along than I thought. I didn't want to be that first-time mom who comes in way too early, but of course I was. When I got there, Marion, one of the primary midwives, asked if I would be okay with a student midwife shadowing my birth. This ended up being such a huge godsend, as Vanessa, the student midwife from Quebec, spoke fluent English, and having someone I could express myself in detail to without translating through my thinking brain, and who could communicate clearly to my husband was awesome. And beyond her language skills, she's an amazing midwife, and I still feel lucky that the stars aligned to give us Vanessa. Unfortunately, I discovered that I was only 2.5 centimeters dilated, but that the baby was in a good position, and I was told that my cervix felt spongy, and they both thought it would be better if I go home for a while, or else I'd be looking at a very long labor there, which could feel demoralizing. Of course, this came true anyways. This was good advice because it was a whole day and a half before I returned. My contractions continued, and even though I didn't realize it at the time, I really resisted them. I somehow forgot everything I had been told about riding the waves of the contractions, but instead I tensed every muscle of my body and clenched my teeth and simply survived them. I thought surviving them was riding them out. For all of the reading and advice I had received about labor, I had no idea what to expect. I had read in the Mindful Pregnancy book about labor boiling down to sensations, but the sensations I experienced were different than what I had thought. The contractions were not close enough together to warrant going back to the birth house, but they were too close together and too intense to do anything in between. Still 7 to 10 minutes apart for a whole day and a half. I couldn't get comfortable in any position, and I felt like my body had nowhere to go. I had known to expect a long pre-labor with my first baby, but I thought I would get some moments in between to rest and regroup. You hear of women baking their birthday cakes and going to the grocery store, but this seemed unimaginable to me. It wasn't until I'd listened to way more stories here on the birth hour before my second birth that I heard other accounts of this super long pre-labor and the term prodromal labor. Although my contractions were spaced apart still, their duration was getting really long. They were lasting 3, 4, 5 minutes. Finally, late that Friday afternoon, I felt like I was going crazy. I didn't feel like I had entered the vortex of birth. That's how the French midwives refer to what we call laborland. I felt sick, still very stuck in my head, wondering if it was the right time, still suspicious it was too early. But I wanted to be in the water. I couldn't go to the beach in a public place. I just needed to be in the tub. And so at some point, I declared that I needed to go into the birth center, if at least for the chance to sit in the tub and have another cervical exam. Because after the amount of time that had elapsed, it seemed like a reasonable request. When I got back to the birth center, my primary midwife had changed from Marion to Anne, but Vanessa, the student midwife, was still there. My exam revealed I was about 4 centimeters dilated, some progress, but not as much as I would have hoped for given the amount of time that had passed. I was given the choice again to stay or go, and I decided to stay and got right into the tub. What a relief that was after so many hours of contractions and so little sleep to get into that warm tub. The contractions felt much more manageable in the water, and there was a vertical piece of fabric for me to grab onto, or as Anne showed me, to sling around my belly and suspend myself. After about an hour and a half, I was told I should get out of the tub, spend some time on the ball, or in some position where gravity was in my favor. Apparently, the water can help things along if they're already underway, but it can also delay or prolong the labor. I found myself thinking about this a lot in the weeks after Remy's birth. Did my time in the water contribute to things stalling, or was it the opposite? Should I have refused to get out of the water because that's where I was the most comfortable? And would that relaxation have led to things progressing faster? Because we all know that stress can also slow things down. Sometime in the middle of the night, my contractions became very different. So much more painful, and they felt like they were radiating from my butt, like my butthole was going to tear apart or explode. I know, and I knew at the time that this was not actually my butthole, but this is the only way I could describe the feeling. I tried to tell myself this was just a sensation, it will pass, but my body was unable to relax through these contractions. At the first sign of this butt pain, my whole body clenched, an automatic response I had no control over. Everything tightened, my shoulders, my jaw, and I'm sure my cervix. Despite repeated encouragement to relax my body, I continued to fight these feelings. It felt like those dreams where you're trying to talk but can't, or trying to swim but not moving through the water. Maybe this was from Remy sitting so low in my pelvis, or maybe this was the point where he turned himself around to the less desirable posterior position. These horrible butt contractions got closer together, about 3 minutes apart, and it was impossible not to make loud groaning sounds to manage the pain. At a certain point, Anne and Vanessa must have heard me because they came to check on me and took this as a great sign that my labor was progressing. I just wanted to get back in the tub. I remember asking if they wanted to do a cervical exam first, and they said no, it wasn't necessary. I think they didn't want to give me unnecessary exams, but in retrospect, it would have been a good idea since we all thought at this point I was way further along than I actually was. There was talk of filling up the inflatable tub that they use for the actual birth, and I really thought that I was fully dilated to 10 centimeters and was getting close to the pushing phase. I think they thought so too, but a cervical exam would have told us all otherwise. When in the tub a second time, the contractions slowed and almost stopped for a while, so I thought this was the big pause that happens in between the two phases. I was with Elliot and feeling like everything was going along smoothly. There was no talk of Remy being posterior at this point. There was the unspoken assumption I was fully dilated, or at least close, and we were left to ourselves in the middle of the night, a feeling of accomplishment and also wondering what the next steps would bring. After some time, though, I was encouraged to get out of the tub, spend more time on the ball, on the toilet, and I was finally given another cervical exam. I noticed the glances exchanged between Anne and Vanessa and was either told directly or indirectly through their body language that we were not quite where we thought we were. I think at this point I was just 7 centimeters dilated, or so they thought. And as the night turned to day, my cervical exams were happening more and more often with the same depressing shared glances, the same 7 centimeters, and the suggestions started rolling in. Move more, sit on the ball. Vanessa tried a very painful body manipulation from spinning babies while I was on my side. Carol, another midwife, had arrived, and so did homeopathic medicines of all sorts, and little sugar balls were being put on my tongue every 5 minutes. I stopped asking what they were, and the feelings of desperation were seeping in. They wanted me to walk. They wanted me to raise a leg up during a contraction. They did some really painful sifting maneuver with a rebozo scarf while I was on all fours. I started feeling really depressed and lonely despite being surrounded by so many people. I felt manhandled by so many well-intentioned midwives. A lot of what I had read about birth talked about tapping into your primal animal nature, but at this point I just felt like livestock, not like some powerful jungle catwoman. I felt really stuck and couldn't see a path forward. My husband was not by my side. I don't know where Elliot was at this point. I think with all the people buzzing about with their desperate ideas, he felt like there were plenty of people around me and disappeared into the background. I know he was there, but that whole day I don't remember him by my side. My mom was there and looking sad and pained to see me in pain. I was forced into the sunlight to take a walk, and that sunlight burst my bubble completely, if there was anything left of it at that point. I couldn't walk, I couldn't relax, and even the tub was losing its luster. Carol was saying a lot of things to me that I didn't want to hear, but there was some truth in what she was saying, and I finally realized that the horrible pain in my butt was the beginning of the contraction, not just a peripheral pain, and that my actions to clench in the beginning of that sensation dictated how I handled it. I used all my willpower to go deep inside myself and let the sensations pass over me, even as my butt felt about to explode. If I did that, and I did it right, I made no sound but a deep exhale, or maybe a loose-lipped low sound. My eyes closed, no clenching, no grabbing onto someone's hand and moaning. I wonder if I had figured this out earlier, if my cervix would have opened instead of stubbornly staying closed. But by the time I figured this out, I was exhausted, and every contraction felt like my breaking point. I could feel the hopelessness in everyone's looks towards me. Still, I somehow rallied another wave of energy, and I ate pan au chocolat in the tub, and I tried to make some jokes. I think I was just trying to shift the mood in the room. For so long, I had been worried that the midwives would say I had to transfer, and then all of a sudden, I realized that maybe I was ready to transfer. But I'm stubborn, and I was kind of willing to do whatever I needed to do to have my baby at this birth center, as long as it was within reason. And the whole time, every time they did intermittent monitoring, Remy's heart rate remained healthy and strong. When Vanessa got back from her break at home, it was finally suggested that we break my water to speed things along. And I'm not entirely sure why this wasn't suggested earlier. It was a last-ditch effort, and we broke the water and found there to be meconium in my amniotic fluid. So this made my decision to transfer to the hospital not my decision, but a must. All of a sudden, there was urgency to leave the birth center quickly. My things were in a bag. My body was on a wheelchair, and I was being whisked away from the cocoon of the birth center with its gentle lighting and thoughtful midwives and calm environment into the bright, sterile hospital. I said goodbye to my mom since I was only permitted one person at the hospital. Once we were there, it was like being put on a conveyor belt. They quickly had me disrobe and preemptively squirt a bunch of iodine all over my naked body before I put on my hospital gown, in case I needed an emergency C-section. I had already decided that my fight was gone, and each contraction seemed more and more unbearable. Even though they weren't necessarily more painful, I just had less ability to handle them. They started me on Pitocin, and I agreed to the epidural. It took her a couple pokes to figure out where to stick the needle for the epidural, which is a bummer because that needle is really long. The relief was almost immediate, but short-lived because it was replaced by another unbearable burning pain in my upper thighs and hips. They had me on my side at this point to try to turn Remy around, and I think that the epidural medicine pooled in a weird place, leading to all that burning pain. A gruff male OB doctor came in and briefly introduced himself to me, but luckily I never saw him again. Elliot and I found ourselves in a room, just the two of us, for a really long time. It seemed a little ironic that our most private moment so far was in this sterile delivery room in a very populated hospital, but that's how it felt. At the birth center, there was my mom and lots of midwives, and even though we shared some nice moments laboring in the tub, there were frequent intrusions. The bubble they had talked about making was hard to make and even harder to maintain. But magically at the hospital, we found ourselves in a little bubble. I remember wondering if Elliot was actually going to have to deliver our baby and if anyone was ever going to come check on us. Apparently, they had a lot of women in labor that night. I took a much-needed nap. Remy turned again and was finally in a favorable position for birth. I remember feeling very disconnected and defeated. I was informed that I came in at only 5 centimeters dilated because it was my water pocket that was holding my cervix open to 7. And once they popped it, it went back down to 5. After my nap, things moved pretty quickly, though. I was told I was close enough to start pushing. Everything I had read had told me not to hold my breath to push, but to breathe the baby down. The nice midwife, Clotilde, who delivered our baby, said I was going to have to do the blocked breathing, or what in English they call the purple pushing, that I wanted to avoid. But she was in charge, and my fight was gone, so I just did what was asked for me. My legs were in stirrups. I was on my back. There were bright lights, wires, everything I didn't want for my birth. I could see the contractions spiking on the screen, but I could also feel the urge to push despite it clouded by drugs. My epidural was one of those lighter self-dosed ones. Pushing required me to go deep, deep inside myself. It was harder than anything I had ever done. Clotilde, my midwife, kept saying I was doing great and getting close and almost there. And I was doing great and getting close and almost there. And I know she was just trying to be positive and reaffirming, but I wish that she had waited until I was closer to there, until I was really almost. I couldn't see what was happening, but at one moment I reached around and could feel his head pushing through. There just always seemed to be another push, and I felt like he was going to stay stuck in there forever. And I remember someone pushing a button, and I thought for sure it was an emergency button because he was so stuck and they were going to have to cut him out or suck him out, or the button was to page the grouchy OB doctor. But it wasn't. Afterwards, I found out it was just the button to redose the epidural, which Elliot and the midwife had both decided I needed more of. The midwife was using her fingers to stretch me open, which was a really uncomfortable sensation. But then again, I didn't end up tearing, so maybe it helped. Finally, a blanket was placed on my chest in anticipation of the baby that would soon be on it. And that blanket was way more reassuring than any of the empty words of encouragement. I was squeezing the hand of the support nurse on one side and Elliot's on the other. And then after what seemed like forever, but wasn't really that long, I think maybe an hour tops, there was a push that was hard enough to push his head through all the way. And then another push, and there was a gush of baby and fluids and relief. Then my baby was on the outside and on my body, and he was so perfect and beautiful. But Elliot, my husband, looked really pale, all of those fluids being a little too much for him, and he needed to go sit down before he fainted. He kept breaking something off of the chair. I think it was like the headrest. And so I kept hearing these crashing sounds in the peripheral, and I thought he fainted, but he never did. He just got close. I remember feeling a pure sort of happiness and wishing Elliot would have been by my side to share that moment too. They did a quick assessment, and we were told that we had a very healthy baby, 10 out of 10 out of 10 APGAR scores, which might be a French Polynesian thing because I hear they don't really give 10s out so easily here in the States. And we were left alone again with this whole new person. Compared to the marathon at the birth center, we were only in the hospital for a little bit. We had come in around 11 p.m., and Remy was born the next morning at 3:21 in the morning. We stayed at the hospital for 3 days because that was the requirement there, even for very healthy babies. We had iron bars on our window and it wouldn't open, and I called it baby jail, even though I have some very nice memories of that time. They had just started relaxing the rules post-COVID, so Elliot was allowed to stay with me, but there was no bed for him and he just had a blanket on the floor. We had a lot of struggles breastfeeding. Remy just didn't seem to open up his mouth or jaw wide enough to latch, and my nipples were relatively flat, and my breasts very large and unruly, and thus began our breastfeeding journey that I'm very proud to say lasted for almost 2.5 years, but it was a really tough one. At the hospital, it seemed like every rotating nurse had a completely different opinion on what I should be doing, on how I should be holding my breast and holding him. Finally, I was given a nipple shield, and although I ended up having a really love-hate relationship with that thing, it saved me in the beginning. Despite many visits with a lactation consultant, visits with an osteopath, visits with my midwives, breastfeeding was extremely painful, and I don't think I was able to breastfeed without pain until about 5 months, which was around the time Remy was able to use his hands to help guide the breast to his mouth. I had lots of recurring plugged ducts. I was constantly flirting with mastitis and painful vasospasms and nipple thrush. It seemed like I got all of it. But I will say that it felt so much more comfortable breastfeeding in public in French Polynesia than I do here in the States. I felt like I could just whip out my boobs wherever and no one would really care. Another thing I loved about breastfeeding in French Polynesia was the term titi mama, which is used to refer to breastfeeding or a mom who breastfeeds or even just to breast milk itself. After my 3 days at the hospital, we went back to our rented bungalow and my midwives from the birth house came and did home visits every other day for a while and then slowly tapered them off. These home visits were so important to me, especially just having people to talk to and help process my feelings after the birth. Even though Remy was born so healthy, I still had a lot of disappointment about the way the birth went. And honestly, I carried that with me until really recently, until my second baby was born. One of my weirder postpartum experiences in French Polynesia was contracting ciguatera when Remy was about 3 weeks old. Ciguatera fish poisoning is a foodborne illness caused by eating tropical reef fish, which have accumulated a naturally occurring toxin or poison called a ciguatoxin. During our travels, we enjoyed a lot of fresh fish and were aware of ciguatera, and we tried to avoid eating fish in areas that were well-known hotspots and steer clear of the types of fish that were known to have high levels of these ciguatoxins. That said, it is impossible to detect, and if you ingest a fish with ciguatoxins, they slowly accumulate in the body, so it's not usually just one meal that's entirely responsible for it. Ironically, the day I got ciguatera, I had opted to eat parrotfish over tuna because I was trying to avoid ingesting too much mercury. And we were also at a nice restaurant, and it just wasn't on my radar like it was when we were eating fish that we caught from the back of our boat. At first, some of the gastrointestinal symptoms can be confused with other illnesses, but it has some neurological symptoms that are a pretty sure way of knowing you have ciguatera, including reversal of temperature sensations. Hot things feel cold and cold things feel hot. So grabbing something out of the freezer or a bite of ice cream feels like fire, and taking a hot shower feels freezing. And there was a burning, itching feeling all over my entire body. At first, I was kind of in denial this was happening, but once I accepted it, I talked to both a doctor and my midwives, and they both agreed that I needed to stop breastfeeding immediately for at least 3 weeks. So I did, and I started pumping throughout the day to keep my supply up, and we got some formula, and I started feeding Remy through a little tube attached to my finger, because at that point, we didn't want to cause any confusion with bottles. It was a really miserable time for me because on top of the really bizarre and uncomfortable feelings from the ciguatera, my hormones were still really out of whack, and I was fully committed to my breastfeeding journey, stubbornly so. After a week or so, I was feeling really depressed and disconnected from my baby. I digested the formula was making him, and so I started to do a little research and could only find 2 references to the transference of ciguatoxins to a baby, and in those cases, there was only a brief mention of rash and diarrhea. I realized that our baby had been drinking the contaminated milk for about a week before we were told to stop with no ill effects. So with much guilt and going against the advice of my doctors and midwives, but feeling like it was the right thing to do for my mental health and Remy's well-being, I decided to start breastfeeding again. I kept a close eye on him and didn't witness any symptoms, but continued to feel so guilty about this that I straight up lied to my midwives during my follow-up visits. Now when I look back on that, I realize I didn't need to lie to them. Because as a parent, you make so many choices and there's not always a clear answer, and you have to really listen to your instincts. But at the time, as a new mom, whenever anyone asked me to follow my instincts, I felt even more discouraged because I didn't feel like I had those well-formed instincts right off the bat. For me, they really had to grow with some time.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing that story. So many different unique things, not only with your birth, but with your postpartum that we definitely haven't had on the podcast before. And I really appreciate you sharing that last bit about the instincts, because I think that's really relatable.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we have one more story to get to. So start us off wherever you want to there as far as deciding to have another baby and getting pregnant with baby number 2.
All right. Sometime after Remy's first birthday, following a really miserable 10-day sailing trip, we made the decision to come back to the States. I was really missing being part of a solid community. You meet so many people when you're out cruising on a boat, but the boating community is really transient. And so you're always saying hello and goodbye to people. And I was feeling the pull to be back and closer to our families. Elliot sailed our boat back with some friends, and I stayed with my mom for a couple months in California, not wanting to spend what ended up being a total of 7 weeks at sea with a 16-month-old, which was totally the right decision for us. We continued living on our boat until last year. We decided to sublet a land home last winter and got a taste of living on land. We had been on the boat for over 5 years, and when Remy was small, it worked really well for us. But as he grew bigger and bigger and became more mobile with more energy, the boat just felt really constricting, and everything felt like a no zone. Once we got settled back in the real world and Elliot found a job, we started talking about having a second baby. I was about to turn 39, and I felt like if we were going to do it, we shouldn't wait too long. Once again, we got really lucky and got pregnant after about 2 months of trying. And that really sealed the deal on whether we were going to move back to the boat or not. Now we are happily and gratefully living back on land with a laundry machine and trash pickup and a hefty mortgage. When I found out I was pregnant, we once again had a lot of decisions to make. We live in Friday Harbor, Washington, which is on San Juan Island. There are no OB services here on the island, and unless you want to go for a home birth, you need to make a plan off-island for your prenatal care and birth. I love the idea of a home birth, and I think if I had been pregnant somewhere else that was close to a hospital in case of transfer, I would have loved to have that experience. But a transfer here would once again mean a helicopter ride off the island, and it didn't seem like the right choice for us. Eventually, I settled on a plan that felt like a good compromise for me. I was able to work with a wonderful local midwife here on the island for my prenatal and postpartum care, and then planned for a birth center birth at the Mount Vernon Birth Center, which was an hour-and-a-half ferry and a 40-minute drive away. A lot of women opt to travel off-island a couple weeks before their births and stay at an Airbnb or with family. We don't have family nearby, and after being at a rental for the weeks before Remy's birth, I really didn't want to do that again, nor could we really afford it. My pregnancy was a pretty normal one, with first trimester nausea, the exhaustion of being pregnant with a toddler in the house, and a crazy amount of heartburn. But we did not run into any major complications. I was still breastfeeding Remy when I got pregnant, and I felt really torn about what to do, because I had always envisioned letting him decide when it was time to wean. At the same time, it was getting really hard at night with a toddler climbing all over my pregnant body and aggressively breastfeeding. My nipples were really sensitive, and I started to be consumed with angry, impatient, and annoyed feelings while he was nursing, which made me feel guilty and confused. There's a Leche League book called Adventures in Tandem Nursing that I found to be really helpful at this time. It's not only written for those who decide to take on tandem nursing, which I was considering at the time, but it has whole sections and anecdotes about breastfeeding while pregnant and deciding whether tandem nursing is a good choice for you. We decided to take some control over the situation and night wean, which we were able to do pretty successfully. I spent a week sleeping in the next room while my husband comforted our toddler at night, and I still breastfed him to sleep and offered him milk when he woke up in the morning. While still undecided on how to proceed, my body made a decision for the both of us when my milk supply completely dried up. I had expected it to go down, but I did not consider the possibility that it would dry up completely. I let Remy continue to dry nurse for longer than I want to admit, thinking it might just come back, but it didn't. I was surprised how devastated I felt to end our breastfeeding journey like that. I'm sure my roller coaster of hormones contributed to those strong feelings, but I felt really blindsided. I think I took it a lot harder than my toddler did. But after some time, I ended up feeling grateful that my body made that choice and that I was given a 4-month breastfeeding break. To prepare for birth this second time around, I reread some of my favorite books, the Naissance en BD books and Birthing from Within. I organized a little art circle with some other pregnant women, and I listened to tons of the Birth Hour podcast. I found comfort in listening to all sorts of stories about all sorts of births, not just about the ones that aligned with the birth I wanted. I was also excited to have a doula this time around as part of our birth team, and I enjoyed meeting with her before the baby was born, having long talks reflecting on my first birth and discussing our hopes for the second birth. More than any physical symptoms, the thing that plagued me the most during this pregnancy was thinking about the logistics of our birth plan. I spent way more time wondering and worrying about the logistics of how to get to my birth than the actual birth itself. We had made the decision to leave Remy at home for the birth. If we went off island too early, we would have to leave Remy for too long, and he had never spent any time away from both of us. And then there was the extra cost of lodging while we were gone. If we waited too long, we risked having to get an emergency helicopter flight off the island. And my midwife reminded me many times that second births can progress a lot quicker. There are a lot of moms here who have had to use that helicopter ride off the island, or occasionally they get a ride in the police boat, and sometimes there are even babies born on the ferry. There's a hospital here that will deliver your baby in an absolute emergency, but it's strongly discouraged. My brain just circled around all the possibilities of how things could go, and in the meantime, my due date came and went. I had been having tons of Braxton Hicks contractions, but that was about it. I had made the decision that if I went 3 or 4 days past my due date, we would just leave the island and then take on some more aggressive natural labor induction methods once off island. There would be no taking castor oil here at home. 3 days after my due date was a Friday. My mom was driving up to help with Remy, and she was going to arrive the next day, and I had plans to meet up with a good friend I had not seen for a long time in the evening. So we decided that we would make our way to the mainland the next morning after getting Remy situated with my mom. However, as the day went on, I started noticing that I was having some super light cramping that was not Braxton Hicks. I noticed it, but I also kind of ignored it because they were so light. Keep in mind that I was in labor for so long with Remy. While I was visiting with my friend that evening, I was telling her about all the delicate logistics of when we should go, and I also mentioned that I had been having some light contractions, and she just looked at me and said, "Margot, I think you should probably go tonight." And after she said that, it was like some sort of bubble of delusion popped in my head. And I was like, oh my gosh, I should go. My super light contractions were about 15 minutes apart at this point, and I heard the voice of my midwife saying that second births happen a lot faster. So I called our friend who was on the hook for watching Remy if we decided to go before my mom got there, and asked her to come over, and we started getting ready. We were catching the last ferry of the night, and when we got to the ferry line, there was nobody there. There were no ferry workers. There were no other cars. There was no ferry waiting at the dock. Everything was dark and deserted, and I had this sinking feeling like we had read the schedule wrong, or that the ferry was canceled. We aren't really in the habit of taking the 10 p.m. ferry to the mainland. But I looked it up, and there were no travel alerts, and sure enough, about a half hour later, we saw the ferry pull up to the dock, which was a huge relief. At this point, my contractions were a lot stronger and about 10 minutes apart, and I had contacted both my midwife at the birth center as well as my doula and told them I was heading to the mainland and would find a hotel and check in with them in the morning. By the time we got on the ferry, I was positive we had made the right decision to go and not wait until the morning. Things were ramping up a lot quicker than I had thought. We decided to pick the closest hotel to the birth center, but I ended up being really disappointed in the place we picked because the bed was up so high that I couldn't get onto the bed on my own, and so I needed Elliot to help me make my very frequent trips to the bathroom. This ended up not mattering much because we were only at the hotel for a couple hours. At 2:30, my contractions were coming 3 to 5 minutes apart and lasting over a minute long, and so we texted our midwife, Angie, and packed up our hotel room and made it to the birth center around 3:30 in the morning. Angie was there to greet us, accompanied by her student midwife, Haven. I feel like I just keep winning the lottery on student midwives. They are the best, or at least mine were, and I feel really lucky. I picked my midwife, but the universe selected the perfect student midwife for each of my births. When I arrived, I felt like I was doing a great job at catching my contractions early and breathing through them. One of my big takeaways from my first birth was how much I had resisted my contractions, how I held on when I needed to let go. I'm a long-distance swimmer, and I have trained for and completed some very long swims. And I think I approached my first birth with the same mentality as I do for a marathon swim. When things got tough, I powered through and I kept going. I relied on my stubbornness and grit. And it's not that those things didn't help me the first time around, but it's not really what the birth required of me. It's impossible to know how much of the long duration of my first birth was due to this resistance and how much of it was just a first-time mom whose body was taking its sweet time because that's just what it needed to do. Birth isn't just about pushing through the pain, but surrendering to it. It was something I didn't discover until a couple hours before I ended up needing to transfer to the hospital with Remy. So the second time around, I really wanted to tap into that surrender. I had asked my husband and birth team to watch out for any signs of clenching and really tried to apply what I had learned from my first birth, how important it was to catch the wave early and breathe through them. I had discovered a really great book called Mother's Breath, a book about yoga breathing for pregnancy and birth, and was able to use some of the practices from there during the first part of labor and again during the pushing phase. I knew I didn't want to get tons of cervical checks, but after the discouragement I felt during my last birth, thinking I was so much farther along than I really was, I knew I wanted to have some checks. During my first cervical check, not long after arriving at the birth center, I was 4 centimeters dilated, 75% effaced, and at 0 station. I only know this because I had my midwife send me my birth notes while getting ready to share my story here. Honestly, my memory of everything after arriving at the birth center is pretty foggy. The whole thing seemed like a whirlwind. I, of course, wanted to get into the tub right away, but was advised to hold off a little bit. I know it took a long time for my doula, Marissa, to get there due to a miscommunication on our part. I thought we had asked her to join us, but she thought we were just keeping her informed and would let her know when we wanted her to be there. Once we clarified that we were indeed ready for her to join us, she made it over pretty quickly. I was really nauseous this time around, and I threw up a handful of times before agreeing to take some Zofran, which helped. I finally made it into the tub around 6 in the morning. While laboring, there's really no better feeling than getting into that tub for the first time. It was a hard tub, though, and given the choice, I think I prefer the soft inflatable tubs for labor and birth. Even though my brain knew the advantages of changing positions frequently and the value of moving and the importance of gravity, I found myself throughout this birth, and both births actually, really resistant to moving and changing positions. Every time I switched positions, I felt like I was in slow motion and that there would be a couple contractions in between each position change, which made me really reluctant to move. After a couple hours in the tub, however, I finally felt like I needed to do something different. When I wasn't in the tub, I favored lying on my side, but I felt like if I found a position that provided any comfort or relief for one contraction, it only worked once. For a while, I was finding it helpful to have my husband pull really hard on my hand and kind of stretching my arm and body out during a contraction. The room at the birth center was so cozy and relaxing, but it didn't have anything hanging from the ceiling to pull down on, which was available to me at the birth house in Tahiti. And so I found myself wishing that I had that as an option. But this hand-arm pulling thing was the closest thing I could get to that. Around this time, I started feeling like my contractions were changing. It was not that I felt a strong urge to push, but I felt a faint urge to push. It was like my body wanted to push because trying to push helped me manage the pain, but I knew I wasn't actually ready to push my baby out. From listening to this podcast, and after having my pushing instinct clouded by my epidural during my last birth, I was really looking forward to experiencing what the ejection reflex felt like that I had heard so much about. But my experience of it was different. It wasn't so black and white. The change in sensations felt really gradual, and so it felt like there was this huge gray area where I wasn't sure if I was through transition or not. But that's probably why they call it transition, and it was just a long transition for me. This was all about 9 a.m., and this is when I really lost my ability to cope well with my contractions. I kept missing the early part of the wave and felt like all my coping strategies went through the window and I was in pure survival mode again. I did not feel like a strong woman. I don't have any memories of having any rest between these contractions the whole night. And this is probably because I was so tired that I was nodding off in between them. And so my conscious memory is just one after another back-to-back contractions. Around 10 a.m., I was asking to go back in the tub, but before I got back in, I agreed to another cervical check and was 9 centimeters with just a small cervical lip on one side. At this point, I was feeling really, really discouraged. Every time someone would come in and tell me some sort of positive affirmation, I shot it right down. They would say, "You're strong," and I would say, "No, I'm not." They would say, "You can do this," and I would say, "No, I can't." To which my doula, Marissa, said, "Yes, you can, and you are doing it." Looking back now, I recognize that this low point was just a part of the journey, that point when you lose all hope and see no way forward, when in fact you're really close to meeting your baby. During this time, I remember clearly thinking that if I was in a hospital, I would have agreed to any intervention they suggested to me, anything. And even though I was feeling so incredibly low, I found myself completely coming to terms and forgiving myself for my hospital transfer and for agreeing to the epidural in Remy's birth. I know Remy's birth was very far from being a traumatizing birth experience, but I was still carrying around a lot of regrets and what ifs. What if I transferred sooner? What if I didn't resist my contractions? What if they popped my water earlier? I was unnecessarily hard on myself after that birth for it not going the way I wanted it to go. And so I held on to a lot of those feelings coming into this birth, putting a lot of pressure on the birth itself to be this experience that I put way up on a pedestal, me trying to control the uncontrollable. And so at this low point, I found clarity and acceptance and forgiveness and completely washed away all those feelings. I finally got back into the tub around 10:30, and even though that's where I wanted to be, I remember my midwife suggesting that I might want to consider going for a walk. And in my head, I was just 100% aware that there was no way I was ever getting out of that tub until my baby was born. And I was right. Around 11 o'clock, I started feeling the urge to bear down, and I was really loud at this point. And I remember hearing other people at the birth center, possibly there for a checkup, and thinking to myself that I must be scaring them because I felt like I was just constantly screaming. Afterwards, both my doula and my husband said that yes, I was loud at that point, but I was just a loud woman in labor and it was nothing to worry about. I remember feeling like I was just going to die there with my baby's head showing, and I kept asking my birth team if I was safe. Most of this time, I had my eyes closed so I could really dig deep into myself to find the strength to keep pushing. But when I opened my eyes, I remember feeling surprised at how calm everyone seemed. And that was really reassuring. More than words telling me everything was okay, that I felt safe and that I was safe, but these calm faces surrounding me. When I expressed discouragement, Angie, my midwife, kept repeating, "This is the way," which made me think of the Mandalorian every time she said it. At 11:20, my water broke, and once again, there was meconium in the water. But once again, there was no evidence that my baby was in any sort of distress. After some time with this super loud, somewhat ineffective pushing, I was able to access a part of my logical brain that remembered some advice from a friend about how if I'm being too loud, my energy is escaping in the wrong direction, and that I needed to direct that energy downward to push my baby out. I also remembered the birthing breath from the Mother's Breath book I mentioned earlier that used the imagery of a coffee pot like a French press. Your body is the coffee pot, and your baby is the coffee grounds, and your breath is the plunger. And each breath you plunge your baby down further and further. This imagery really stuck with me, and it totally worked. And after being forced to do the purple pushing with my first birth, this felt so much more powerful. Not long after I tapped into this effective coffee plunger pushing, Esme was born at 11:36 a.m. I myself was born at 11:36 p.m., and I found this to be a really cute coincidence. I was able to reach down and pull her out of the water and up onto my chest, and then there she was, my beautiful baby girl, and there is really nothing like that moment after your baby is born and they are on your chest. My umbilical cord was so curly, like a telephone cord, and they encouraged me to get out of the tub so I could deliver the placenta on the bed, since it's apparently safer to be out of the water if there's any hemorrhaging, which luckily there was not. The tub water was so gross. You think in your head of a water birth, and you think of like little floating flowers and candles and maybe even like lily pads. I don't know. But the reality was this murky brown, gross water. Getting out of the tub was really hard. And it would have been hard. It would have been nice to just sit there in that moment with my daughter on my chest for a while longer before having to come back to earth and navigate my slippery, exhausted body out of the tub while holding an even slipperier, tiny human still attached to me. My placenta was delivered no problem, and we all cuddled on the bed. I feel so grateful for having been able to give birth at a birth center and out of the hospital this time around. The environment felt so cozy and relaxed, and you just have that burst of adrenaline, and we were making placenta prints and cracking jokes and eating these amazing sandwiches my doula had picked up. I tried to apologize for how negative and down on myself I got in the throes of birth and was told that it is just part of how it's done. If they would have let me, I would have loved to stay in that cozy room at the birth center a while longer, even for the entire night. But with birth centers, it's expected that you clear out pretty quickly after they examine you and the baby. And so we left the birth center about 3.5 hours after Esme was born. And then we were on the ferry home with our 5-hour-old baby and got back to our house by dinner time. So after all that worrying about logistics, we by some miracle timed everything perfectly, and we were not even gone for 24 hours. Although my blood pressure had been normal for both pregnancies, I ended up getting postpartum hypertension and needing blood pressure medication this time around. And this made me really anxious for the first couple of months after Esme was born. Once again, we were having some struggles breastfeeding. I am still, almost 3 months later, having a hard time getting Esme to latch properly. She seems to have a really disoriented suck, but she's able to get enough milk because it's just coming out so fast that she doesn't really need to latch on, just gulp it down. Even though this is really frustrating, I feel like I have a lot more tools in my toolbox the second time around. And despite our challenges, I do not have the nipple pain that I did with Remy, mostly because she's not actually latching. And so the challenges have seemed more bearable, and I am hopeful we will figure it out.
All right. Yeah. Hopefully as she gets bigger, it gets easier. I feel like it's always like a milestone when the baby's head is like bigger than my boob and then they can latch on more easily.
Yeah. And I will say I have very large breasts. And so then the baby's head is really small. It just doesn't seem like it fits together.
Yeah. I was the same way. All right. Thank you so much for sharing both of those stories. We will share photos and stuff from them on the show notes. They're really cool to see, especially the ones when you were in French Polynesia and everything. So people can go to the show notes to see that. And then what resources do you want to share?
I'm pretty sure I mentioned most of my resources kind of while I was talking. There was the Birthing from Within book that I love. And I really, if anyone speaks French, those Naissance en BD books are just really awesome. And if that author is listening to this podcast for any reason and wants to do an English translation, I would totally be her girl. That book is great. There are actually 3 books in that series. And then that Mother's Breath book was a really awesome find this time around. I put a couple other books down there, and then I also just put links to the places where I gave birth because I feel like I wanted to give a shout out to all those wonderful places and people.
Okay, awesome. Well, we'll put those links and things on your show notes as well. And then what's the best way for people to connect with you?
I am on Instagram. My accounts are private, but I'm happy to have people reach out and ask me any questions, or especially if anyone is wanting to get into boat life with kids or curious about how that goes. I'm happy to talk about it. I can either get you interested in it or get you uninterested in it, depending on what you want to hear. So.
All right. Sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Margot, for sharing today.
Yeah, thank you.
Now I'm going to chat with Kate about Aeroflow breast pumps and how you can get your breast pump and other things for free through insurance, like their online classes, accessories, all kinds of great things. All of that is at aeroflowbreastpumps.com/birth hour. All right, let's hear from Kate. Hi, Kate. Thanks so much for coming on the Birth Hour today to chat with me about Aeroflow breast pumps.
Yay. Hi, Bryn. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, you reached out via Instagram about Aeroflow and your experience with them, and I was so excited to talk with you. So will you just tell people a little bit about, how you found Aeroflow and the process you went through for using their services?
Yeah, for sure. So it was actually through the Birth Hour, through your podcast, that I heard about Aeroflow and decided to just fill out the form. It's like a very simple form you fill out online where you put in your insurance information, and then Aeroflow does the rest.
Yeah.
And so they got me a free breast pump. I think it was the Spectra is the one that was the one I chose through insurance. But Aeroflow will actually show you all of the different pumps available to you, how much they cost through insurance. Some of them you do have to pay a little bit, and then they show you the ones that are fully covered. And so I decided, I chose the Spectra, and they sent it to me. And then I think I got an email or a text that said hey, thanks for, using Aeroflow. You should also sign up for our lactation classes. And, you get tons of those sort of promotional emails.
Right.
And I didn't think much of it. I was okay, whatever, I'll take a look at this later. And then I started looking more into it, and I was oh, actually these classes look pretty cool. They were fully virtual and they were covered by insurance. And so I decided, I was what the heck, let's do it. And I signed up for, I think, 4 different classes. I only made it to 2 of them, but the 2 that I went to were Lactation 101 and Pumping 101. And they're just such great classes. I was so surprised by the quality of the classes. They're taught by, is it
IBCLC.
Yeah. And they just gave a ton of good information about starting breastfeeding off right. And so it also would be helpful too for people who are newly breastfeeding, just kind of work through some potential breastfeeding issues like latching or positioning. But yeah, I contribute a lot to my success. So my daughter is 4 weeks old now. And we had a pretty solid start to breastfeeding. I've been exclusively breastfeeding, and I contribute a lot of it to having that support from the class. The way the classes run too they're live.
Oh, cool. That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, they're virtual. So you can join via Zoom.
Yeah. But
they're live. And so the instructor is there teaching the course. They're also really just super good teachers. I felt the way they presented information was really good. They had tons of visuals and videos, live demonstrations where they have a baby doll and they were showing different positions and ways to get baby to latch. And so they are live though, so you can ask questions. And so you're able to ask questions in the chat. You can, unmute and have a conversation back and forth. So very helpful for like if you have specific questions too about lactation.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, especially like you said, like even after baby arrives, to be able to like look at the positioning of the baby doll and like position your own baby on screen and be like, like this, or that's great.
Yeah, it's really helpful. And like the pumping 101, like this is my first baby and I had never pumped before.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have the same pump that they were using in the demo, the Spectra.
Oh, nice.
And so it was really cool I kind of like walked along with, like did the demo along with them on the same pump, which was just really helpful, having never used a breast pump before. Like,
yeah.
They look kind of scary. At least to me, they looked pretty scary. And so it was nice to like be able to sort of walk through with the instructor and get a demo.
So when you were signing up for it, was the scheduling, were there like several a month or like lots of options? Or
Yeah, that's a good question. It was pretty convenient. They gave a few times a month, I want to say, and like different, I want to say they were like different hours too.
Okay.
But it was like scheduling was really, really easy. I remember like, cause they have, all your information, like they have insurance information already. And so they do all the back end work of clearing this with insurance, because they're classes run by professionals and they do cost money, but insurance covers the cost. And so they would like take attendance at the beginning of the Zoom call. And then they did like all that back end work to make sure it was covered by insurance. And so I didn't have to do anything except like put in my name and email to sign up. So yeah, like really easy.
Awesome. And
again, like kind of going into it, I was like, I'll give this a try, kind of see what it's like. And then I was just like captivated. I remember after getting off particularly the lactation 101 call, and just like being like to my partner, like, oh my gosh, you've got to hear like what I learned.
Oh, cool.
Like he was like, wow, you see, like, you're like an expert now in lactation. I was like, I feel like it. Like, I feel like I'm like, have a lot of good, solid information. So yeah, like super pleasantly surprised by how informative and just helpful the classes were.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I think that I had posted about Aeroflow on Instagram and you responded like, their classes are amazing. And so I knew you were passionate about it enough to like respond to an Instagram story.
Yeah.
So that's very cool. And I knew they had lactation education, but I wasn't fully aware of the format and everything and the fact that they're live. I mean, that's like having your own virtual lactation consultant. So that's amazing.
And I had taken like a childbirth ed class, paid for, like it was a community one that I paid for here. And I live in Minneapolis. And it was like, one of the weeks we went over lactation, and it was like similar information, but like free, like I was like, and it also like it was kind of went more in depth, because the Aeroflow class was specifically a lactation class, like the lactation 101 class is what I'm thinking of. So yeah, it was just like very quality, like good information.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm going to add this definitely to our resources on the website and our childbirth course, because we go over a lot of that stuff as well. But the live aspect, I think, is just so great, even if it's a refresher for, second or third time, or you already took a class, just something to kind of get a refresher and ask questions and things like that. So.
And there are some other classes, like the other ones I signed up for but didn't end up making. There was like one on like maternity leave, like, and your kind of like, I think, lactation stuff around leave and like going back to work.
Right.
But yeah, they were all covered through insurance. So.
Very cool. Well, I'm going to have to reach out to Aeroflow and audit these classes so that I can talk about it more as well. But thank you so much for shining a spotlight on it.
Yeah, for sure. Highly recommend. So when you get that email or that text that says, hey, do you want to also sign up for the classes? You should do it. Because like I said, I was kind of like, oh yeah, okay, whatever, like promotional email for Airflow, but.
Right. And we're all paying so much for insurance, like we might as well get as much out of it as we can.
Totally. It was well worth it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Kate.
Yeah, of course, Bryn. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much again to Margot for sharing her birth stories with us and to Aeroflow for sponsoring this episode. You can get more information from today's episode on the show notes, which you can find by going to thebirthhour.com and searching for Margot's name in the search bar. I'll also include some of the links mentioned at the beginning of this episode in the podcast app where you're listening to it. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, head to thebirthhour.com and click Become a Member to pledge your support.
And as a thank you, you'll get an invitation to join our private Facebook group and access to exclusive episodes. Your vote of confidence and support means the world to me.